This is Lee Habib, host of Our American Stories. Every March across this country, children and their teachers recognize a man most of us know by name. But we don't know his story. Rather ironic considering his profession involved storytelling through animation. We're, of course, referring to Dr. Seuss. Here to tell the story of the man behind Green Eggs and Ham, The Lorax, and The Cat in the Hat is Brian J. Jones, author of Becoming Dr. Seuss, The Making of an American Imagination. Let's get into the story.
Dr. Seuss was born Theodore Seuss Geisel, in fact, in Springfield, Massachusetts. He is the son of a very successful brewing family. They're German immigrants who his grandfather had come to the United States and set up a brewing company that was very successful. And so Seuss was around German brewers, loved listening to his German ancestors, his family members, talking German. He would sit at the top of the stairs and listen to the conversation downstairs. He loved the sound of that language and how if you have a German word and you want to qualify something, you just keep adding on to the word and it gets longer and more interesting. At one point, he talks about going to school during World War I and having children chasing him and throwing coal at him saying, "Kill the Kaiser." They knew he was a German immigrant. That always sort of stayed with Seuss a lot of his life. I think that's where he gets sort of his, love for the underdog and for the oppressed. And I think a book like The Sneetches is probably sort of born out of that sheer feeling of being the outsider, being the other that he experienced even as a child when people threw coal at him for being German. His mother is Henrietta Seuss, or Seuss is actually the correct way of pronouncing the name. Seuss is his mother's maiden name. That's where he gets the name Seuss from. Seuss always said that, it rhymed with Mother Goose, or somebody pointed that out to him, so he was always okay with people pronouncing it Seuss. His mother, he often said, is the one who inspired his love of rhyme. She had worked in a bakery, and she would, chant little poems on the flavors of pie they had available that day, which always cracked him up. So Seuss's father inherited the brewing company right about the time that Prohibition kicked in. And so Seuss's father never ended up running the company. And in fact, they were in danger of losing everything. Seuss's father then, of course, ended up in a job as superintendent of parks for Springfield, which is a job he had most of his life after that. And Ted, as everybody always called Seuss as a kid, grew up around the parks and going to the zoo there in Springfield. And he often joked about how, his father would put him in the cages and let the animals chew on him and things like that, none of which happened. Seuss never lets the truth get in the way of a fantastic story. But Seuss, had this sort of just this creative, regular kid's life in Massachusetts at the turn of the century. It's really interesting. Springfield is a really interesting town. It's almost like this imaginative hub up there in that part of New England. Like Milton Bradley is from there, and Naismith created basketball at the YMCA there in Springfield. I mean, it's like all these weird little, American industries and icons came out of there. I think Smith & Wesson came out of there. It's just, there's all sorts of really fascinating people that were in and around Springfield. So Seuss comes out of Dartmouth University as a fairly mediocre student, but manages to get a scholarship to go to Oxford. He told his father, in fact, that he had applied for a scholarship and won it, and that actually turned out to not be true. But his father had bragged all over town that his son was going to Oxford. So once he found out it wasn't true, he paid to send his son to Oxford anyway. So Seuss is going to Oxford on his father's dime at this point. And quickly finds out he'd rather do anything but study English. He initially went to go be an English professor, quickly loses interest in it, but he meets a woman who would eventually become his wife, a woman named Helen. And she is sitting next to him in class one day as he's doodling and says, somebody who draws the way you do should do that for a living. And so Seuss, who ends up marrying Helen, and they end up living together back in the United States, he sets up shop, and this is in the sort of the gilded age of the United States, the mid to late 20s, and he embarks on this very successful career. And it's hard to believe now that you can set up a career doing something like this. But he has a very successful career trajectory as a cartoonist for the magazines. It's like almost like today's New Yorker cartoons, but he's doing cartoons for Liberty magazine and Judge magazine and all these magazines with these massive circulations, and earning his living doing that. But he also manages to get an incredibly lucky, fortuitous moment where he does this cartoon that has a knight laying in bed. There's a dragon sticking its head through the window. And the knight says, "Another dragon, and here I just had the entire castle sprayed with Flit." Flit was a bug repellent, very popular in the era. Well, the woman who was married to the man who ran the ad campaign for Flit, I mean, this is none of those crazy stories, saw that cartoon in the magazine, went to her husband and said, "This is the greatest advertisement for Flit you could ever ask for. You need to hire this young man to be your Flit ad man." So Seuss ends up in advertising through this, and he's a very successful ad man. He's the Don Draper of 1925. He ends up running the Flit campaign for, I think, something like 17 years. Just full page ads and color billboards, and it became sort of a running joke like, "Where's the beef?" or something like that. "Quick Henry the Flit" was the tagline, and it was used in songs, and it was in punch, like comedians would say, "Quick Henry the Flit," and everyone would laugh. They all got the joke. So Seuss had this very successful career as an advertising man for years before he ever got into children's books. What finally happened was he had done some illustrations for a book that was sort of like Kids Say the Darndest Thing. It was like this book of kids saying funny things that were true, and then he would put the illustrations in it. And Seuss thought, under my contract with Flit, I have a non-compete clause, so I can't draw for a book like this. But there was nothing in his contract that said he couldn't do children's books. So because there was a loophole in his contract, there was essentially money on the table still there for children's books. So Seuss decides to write a children's book purely, basically because he had a clause in his contract that said he could, or that didn't say that he couldn't. It wasn't any great calling, at least at that time, to provide great books for kids, or because he felt some compelling urge to write them for kids. So he went ahead and started to write a children's book, and that's where the book "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street" came from. His work on children's books for part of his career didn't pay his bills. Children's books was a side hustle for him for quite a long time.
To catch the rest of this remarkable story, go to the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.